Great. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've had a good break. We're going to make a start for our final session. I'm Sarah Hall, Deputy Director of UK and Changing Europe. Oh my gosh, that's the second time. Promise you that's not deliberate. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Anneliese Dodds, MP, who'll be speaking around the broad theme of inequalities. Anneliese is a Member of Parliament for Oxford East. She's also Chair of the Labour Party and Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. Anneliese is going to give a talk of around half an hour. If you have questions, then please do use Slido, as we've been using throughout the day, and then we'll open the floor for a moderated conversation with Anneliese after her talk. So without further ado, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to close what I know has been a fascinating day of discussion about Britain's place in the world 7 years after the UK voted to leave the EU. I was elected as a member of the Westminster Parliament 6 years ago. I'm no veteran of the House of Commons, but the fact we've had 2 general elections, 4 prime ministers, and 6 chancellors of the Exchequer in that period certainly makes me feel like one. The beginning of the Westminster Parliament that I came into, the 2017 Parliament, was marked by the horrendous Grenfell disaster. Since then, as of course you know, the UK has left the EU, gone through a global pandemic, and is currently experiencing a crippling cost of living crisis, while a new war rages on the European continent. We experienced the hottest ever summer last year in the UK and the first wildfire caused by the climate crisis in our own capital. Each of these developments has had profound consequences. Taken together, they represent a period of upheaval, political, social, and economic upheaval, the likes of which we haven't seen for a generation. Now, more than ever, they signal the need to put the divisions of the past behind us. For Britain, that does mean a future outside the EU, a future outside the single market and the customs union with no return to free movement. But just because the UK has left the EU doesn't mean that we can't look to a bright future together as partners, neighbours and allies. That's why I want to start with some reflections on the value of cooperation in today's age. I'll then consider ways in which there's much more to do to address specifically inequalities in our society and the contribution that can be made by us all, including, dare I say it, the experts in this room and those joining online. Many speakers today, I know, have reflected on the international cooperation we've seen against Putin's aggression. For all its twists and turns, there's no doubt that countries worked together and continue to do so, with the UK taking decisive action in concert with the EU, the US and NATO allies to punish Vladimir Putin's murderous Russian regime. Our collective, bold and robust measures have sent the message that aggression will not be tolerated. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has also reawakened a need to work together to build resilience in the face of 21st century threats and prove that the UK and EU can and must work together to bring our collective force to keep us safe. That's why the Labour Party has put a new UK-EU security pact at the heart of our foreign policy offer to the British public. We've committed to seeking new cooperation across foreign policy through regular EU-UK summits and structured dialogue to tackle Europe's shared threats in areas like cyber, energy security, and organised crime. The war in Ukraine has also demonstrated that when we protect those who need our help, we do not diminish our strength or security, but add to it. That supporting those in need can support us all, and that the forces which seek to divide and undermine ultimately weaken their own moral and practical authority. This brings me to my second point. Success is not achieved by pushing the most vulnerable down, but by pulling everyone up. That belief has always been critical to our country's values of tolerance and fair-mindedness. Survey evidence indicates that Britons overwhelmingly believe that everyone should have a fair shot at life, regardless of which part of the country they come from or who their parents are. Our country is a self-made nation in that sense. However, the realisation of that level playing field has required persistent political action and consistent political will. From Barbara Castle's Equal Pay Act to Harriet Harman's Equality Act, from civil partnerships to the repeal of Section 28, and from the legalisation of abortion to the Race Relations Act. All delivered, yes, by my party, the Labour Party, but each following many years or even decades of campaigning by ordinary people who then expressed their commitment to breaking down barriers to opportunity at the ballot box. If Labour wins the next election, I will become the UK's first ever Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. That means having someone at the top table dedicated to advocating for equality and making sure fairness is embedded in every facet of government policy making. There are some areas of policy rightly described as wicked problems, where the impact of public policies can be unpredictable, where success is dependent on sustained action over very long periods of time, and where international factors can easily blow progress off course. But just because a problem is wicked does not mean that politicians should not seek to tackle it, nor that it must remain wicked over time. In areas like combating the climate crisis, international evidence on what works has unpicked much of the knot. That makes Labour's mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower, backed by our Green Prosperity Plan, our answer to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, all the more urgent. Yet when it comes to advancing equality, the problem isn't wicked, it's willful. Many of the policy tools are already in the government's hands, if only ministers would use them. To realise greater equality often requires quite a simple recipe: a modest portion of evidence about what works with a dollop of political will on top. Yet sadly, over recent years, we've not only seen an indifference to inequality, but a determination to underscore areas of ideological difference in the heat of political combat. Rather than the light of data and experience, we felt the hot air of divisive rhetoric. One example comes from the worrying area of hate crime. Some politicians on the political right have rhetorically claimed that a focus on countering hate crime has diverted police from tackling violent crime. Yet amongst the surge in all hate crimes, we see a substantial increase in violent hate crime. They're not two opposing phenomena, but two sides of the same coin of hatred, violence, and too often impunity for perpetrators. That's why Labour is determined to make Britain's streets safe by halving all serious violent crime, including violent hate crime. Another example comes from the shocking inequalities in health outcomes in our country. It took the COVID-19 pandemic to expose the extent of this crisis. My friend and colleague, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, produced a vital report showing the avoidable tragedy of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people. Now, the Conservative government initially acknowledged that problem by setting up a commission on race and ethnic disparities. But then they endorsed a report from the same commission that quibbled over the legacy of the slave trade and denied the existence of structural racism. Instead of this divisive approach, we need to focus on the reality of inequality in our country. And here the evidence, despite the rhetoric, is sadly clear. The British people are more than ever supportive of action to remove barriers to opportunity. But over the last 13 years, progress in removing these barriers has stalled. Today, 53 years after Labour's Equal Pay Act, many women still experience pay inequality over their whole careers. And more women, old and young, are dropping out of the labour market than ever before for a variety of reasons. There's been an explosion in insecure work, with zero-hour contracts and fire and rehire particularly impacting the lowest paid workers, especially Black, Asian, and minority ethnic workers. There are more children especially black children growing up in poverty, and more disabled people struggling to make ends meet. And for the first time in decades, life expectancy is going down in our country. The number of women dying in childbirth is rising too, and black women are 4 times more likely to lose their lives giving birth than white women. In many ways, there's more political commentary about equality than ever. More argument about what's woke and what's anti-woke. But over the years, there has been less and less delivery while the bluster bandwagon rolls on. It hasn't helped that over recent years, the minister responsible for oversight of the government's equalities agenda has been dumped in the laps of those who hold other major roles, like Foreign Secretary, Trade Secretary, or Business Secretary. In one of the many surreal developments of the ill-starred Truss interregnum, this role was briefly held actually by a man who at one point was apparently no longer responsible even for policies for women. Competing pressures from managing 2 areas of policy delivery at the same time have meant the current occupant of the Women and Equalities brief has struggled to attend women and equalities questions in the House of Commons, failing to fulfil even the most basic duty of a Minister of the Crown by being present to answer questions from fellow MPs, as we saw yet again today. Since 2010, the Government Equalities Office has also found itself tossed around in the tempest of Tory turmoil. Successive Prime Ministers have shoehorned its remit into whatever other policy portfolio the Women and Equalities Minister was also tasked with. In addition, both the Government Equalities Office and the Equality and Human Rights Commission have seen their budgets slashed in that time, with either the connivance or indifference of the minister whose duty it should have been to promote their vital work. What's the result of these years of ministerial merry-go-round? A department whose task force on the national scandal of maternal mortality didn't meet for a whole 9 months. A department that has not been able to ban anti-LGBT conversion therapy practices, despite promising that more than 5 years ago. A department that dragged its feet and then gave up on implementing the Lamy Review into the treatment of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in the criminal justice system. A department that's overseen runaway increases in hate crime of every category, soaring waiting lists for vital gynecology procedures, and a gender pay gap that won't close for women in their 50s until 2050. Under the Conservatives, the Government Equalities Office has all but abandoned women after the pandemic, which led to the biggest setbacks to gender equality in a generation. Today, it has just 2 flagship programmes for women. The first is an initiative to get new mothers back into science, technology, engineering and mathematics jobs, but it's yet to get off the ground despite being launched twice in 2 years. The second is a pay transparency pilot, which I can reveal today has actually been quietly sidelined and will no longer be a separate programme within the Government Equalities Office. That forms part of a restructure that will also see the removal of several senior experts. Now, the tireless officials trying to make a difference aren't to blame for the failure of the last 13 years. But what has been missing is a focus on evidence rather than divisive rhetoric and the political will to make a difference. So here's the crux. From the labour market to housing, health, justice and education, the role of government should be to remove barriers to ambition and success for everyone. This isn't only because public opinion strongly supports such action, but also because we simply cannot afford to do otherwise. Keir Starmer recently announced a mission for Britain to have the highest sustained economic growth in the G7. After 13 years of stagnant growth, the UK has fallen behind our traditional economic competitors like France and Germany. It will require harnessing the talent, creativity and brilliance of everyone in Britain from all backgrounds and all corners of our country if we're to achieve that mission. Labour recently released analysis showing that closing the employment gap that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people face could add almost £36 billion to our economy. That's £36 billion, which we can't afford to ignore through inaction. We also know that 185,000 women aged between 50 and 64 have become economically inactive since the start of the pandemic. And 1 in 10 women experiencing menopausal symptoms have left their jobs, with 14% of women having reduced their hours due to the lack of support in the workplace. As with opportunities for Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, helping women to return to or stay in work is good for those women, good for their employers, and good for all of us. In fact, it could add another £7 billion to our economy. Delivering change requires understanding the evidence. That's why we will legislate to introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting as part of the landmark new Race Equality Act that we're determined to deliver. Because the evidence shows this works. We will enable gender pay comparisons across employers, again, because we know this can drive change. We've learned from businesses about other successful measures they've taken to increase opportunity, so we'll put those into practice as well. Labour will require large employers to put in place menopause action plans to set out how they'll help their workers going through the menopause. And we also understand that many women can't stay in work if they're on a seemingly endless NHS waiting list. So we'll pull our NHS back from the brink and recruit thousands more doctors, nurses, and health visitors. We'll also act on sexual harassment in the workplace, including by third parties. Sadly, this is still widespread in our country, with 1 in 2 women and 7 out of 10 LGBT+ workers having experienced it. This is where government can really make a difference. A recent study of sexual harassment policy in almost 200 countries showed the benefits for women's economic outcomes that come from the introduction of laws and policies prohibiting sexual harassment at work, from boosting participation in the labour force to improving pay for women. That's why, as part of Labour's New Deal for Working People, we'll require employers to create and maintain workplaces and working conditions free from that harassment. We've also published a comprehensive agenda to tackle violence against women and girls, because we know that such cross-cutting action is urgently needed, and we also know about the economic impact of that scar on our society. Labour will also stand up for LGBT+ people in government and treat them with dignity and respect, not use them as a political football. We'll start by implementing the recommendation of the Law Commission on reforms to hate crime laws, by strengthening and equalising law so that every category of hate crime is treated as an aggravated offence. Under Labour, everyone who falls victim to hate crime will be treated equally under the law, and the perpetrators of anti-LGBT and disability hate crime will no longer dodge longer sentences. We'll also learn the lessons from the SNP's botched reform of gender recognition laws in Scotland, a failure that leaves trans people in limbo as Holyrood and Westminster fight out their future in the courts. Instead, we will build consensus around modernising the Gender Recognition Act to remove indignities for trans people while upholding the Equality Act, its protected characteristics and its provision for single-sex spaces. And we'll heed the advice of experts from the British Medical Association in mind that conversion practices constitute psychologically damaging abuse. We'll legislate to ban that practice in all of its forms, with an inclusive ban for all LGBT people. And of course we can do that while protecting the provision of legitimate counselling and talking therapies. Labour wants a ban that's laser targeted at coercive conversion practices, not one that can be assailed by straw man arguments about what does and doesn't constitute conversion therapy. International best practice shows this is perfectly possible via well-drafted and precise legislation, and that's the standard by which we will judge any conversion therapy bill brought forward by the Conservatives. Now, as we've been drawing up our practical, deliverable plans for change, we've been learning from businesses, from our own country's history, and from experts, as I said. So our New Deal for Working People draws on evidence from successful British businesses, often working with their recognised trade unions, who've driven up productivity and sustainable profits by adopting modern practices in the workplace. But comparative evidence about what works is also vital. The UK used to be a country from which other nations drew policy inspiration. Our instinctive, tolerant mindset as Brits, codified in legislation like the Equality Act, is often praised internationally. And as a former member of the European Parliament, I will admit to sometimes being shocked by the experience of colleagues, such as the fellow former MEP from a different country who was told she could not be elected as a new mother, so would be shifted to the bottom of her party's list. Or the lack of ethnic diversity in representation in the European Parliament beyond Labour's MEPs. The last 13 years, however, have sadly undermined the UK's international reputation for sound decision-making and competent government. We can learn so much from how other countries see us. And their views of recent governments have been revealing, shifting from first disbelief to anger, and then in many cases, resignation. The current government's approach to the Equality Act is perhaps a case in point. 13 years after Labour passed that landmark legislation, it's still protecting people in countless ways every day. The legal framework it provides against discrimination by employers, businesses, schools, public bodies, and many other institutions is one that many other countries still look to and seek to learn from. This was a legislative achievement that cemented our country's reputation as a beacon of equality at the time, and of which my party is still proud 13 years on. Perhaps that's why Conservative ministers have started to take aim at the Equality Act with increasing regularity, from criticising protected characteristics to describing the Act itself as a Trojan horse. What started out as a few political potshots against this groundbreaking law is in danger of becoming a creeping barrage with worrying consequences for the future of equality in the UK. Yet at the same time, the Prime Minister is casting himself as a defender of the Equality Act and stating that he backs the protections it contains for women. To listen to him, you wouldn't think that these protections had already been enshrined in law for 13 years. Once again, this isn't about the evidence, but about pushing rhetoric that only seeks to sow division and weaken the overwhelming consensus view that is in favour of building a fairer, more equal Britain. So today I want to be very clear. Labour is proud of the Equality Act and proud of the protections it provides. And I say today to Rishi Sunak, you can't claim ownership of women's equality when your party has been failing women for 13 years. You can't disparage Labour's Equality Act one day to use it as a political crux the next. The Equality Act protects everyone, and that's why Labour will oppose any Conservative attempt to undermine it. We will defend it from attack from bad faith actors, and we will protect and uphold it in government, including its protected characteristics and provisions for single-sex exemptions. We can't expect progress, sadly, from our current government on equality, so recently we've had to turn to other nations beyond our own to see it. Spain, for example, has a ministry dedicated to equalities at the highest level of government to undertake proper equality impact assessments and ensure they're acted on. In Sweden and Finland, gender equality is integrated at all stages and levels of government policy making, ensuring equality is baked into the lawmaking process in a way that goes beyond rhetoric and works to deliver better outcomes. The result can be seen in the index prepared by the European Institute for Gender Equality, which ranks Sweden and Finland amongst the highest EU countries on an aggregate of equality measures. In many OECD countries today, life expectancy continues to increase for women, while in the UK, it's come to a standstill. And the sweeping electoral gains won by Labour's sister party in Australia in recent elections demonstrate that prioritising equality is a vote-winning strategy. Taking inspiration and learning from around the world are critical for changing our own nation for the better. That's why I'm so glad that networks like the UK in a Changing Europe still exist to share best practice and knowledge. They're needed now more than ever. Experts are not part of the problem. They're how we know what will achieve change in the most efficient and effective way possible. Thank you for inviting me here today, And I look forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anneliese. There's loads of questions that I'd love to ask, and we've had loads of questions coming in. But I'm going to use the chair's prerogative, if I may, to start with. So one of the things that struck me about your speech was your emphasis on the kind of economic dividends that might be gained by addressing different types of inequalities. And I wondered how that sat alongside other potentially more structurally based inequalities, so particularly issues around class, for example, and how that figures in your thinking on this.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. And I think, again, there the comparative evidence is really, really clear. When you've got different societies where there are heavily entrenched inequalities, they tend to be amongst the least economically dynamic societies. And you're absolutely right to focus on class and income as an aspect of that, of course, one which then intersects with other forms of inequality. But again, I would say if we look at the Equality Act, yet again, that Act from 2010, there is within that Act a provision to apply a socioeconomic duty on public bodies. We've seen the adoption of that measure by quite a number of public bodies already, actually, even though they're not required under law. And that's meant that from the beginning, in policy making, issues around inequality have to be at the least discussed. Really make sure that they're placed on the table when we're taking some of those really big decisions. I think if we consider, for example, the debate around windfall tax at the moment within the UK, obviously Labour called for that tax. We were disappointed when it was put into place, however, because it's got really big loopholes within it. Now, if that discussion had perhaps considered the relative merits of freeing up additional resource from a tax that didn't have loopholes in it for supporting those who are in need, who are struggling at the moment, then we might have seen a different decision being taken at the end.
Great. One of the other issues that you emphasise quite a lot in the speech is the value of evidence and expertise, and also the value of that through kind of cross-national or international comparison. And obviously, with our UK Changing Europe hat on, we're very on board with that message. At the same time, I was quite struck by your discussion around kind of opportunity for all, and that made me think about sharing expertise from within the UK, and particularly thinking about geographical differences and how inequalities figure differently geographically. So, I think the statistic that gets used most frequently is kind of differences in life expectancy. You drew attention to differences in life expectancy for women, but obviously we know that they are also really profoundly geographically uneven. So I wondered how that kind of regional variation and learning from within the UK might figure.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and we've seen so many of those inequalities, of course, intensify. We know that the UK is one of the most regionally unequal countries in all of the OECD, and therefore we really do need to make sure that we are focusing on those inequalities and delivering practically. One of the frustrations I've had over recent years is that in theory we've had the rhetoric around, in inverted commas, levelling up. We have not seen delivery, actually, in terms of measures, particularly those focused on people, on things like upskilling, for example, where Labour set out a strategy, New Skills England body that would then be working with local actors to drive that change. We've just not seen that change. It's actually, ironically, been extremely centrally driven, with core decisions being taken by a kind of clutch of ministers a lot of the time, not by those in those different areas. So, I do think part of this is about where power is exercised from. Labour has set out a number of measures on that. Our Take Back Control Act, for example, I realise the title may not be one that everyone is happy with, but for me it indicates what we want to do, which is that we want to make sure we do take back that control for communities to actually have more of a stake in their economic destiny. And I think it's something that we really have to do. Just finally, in terms of sharing best practice, it's something that I've been very committed to doing, both in my role relating to equality, but also as the chair of the Labour Party. So as part of the policy review that I conducted last year, we started a series called Labour Works. Now, that was just drawing examples from my party in government And of course, it'd be great if other parties did that as well. But it was looking at what, for example, the Welsh Labour government has done, what our metro mayors have been doing, what our Labour-run local authorities have been doing, and the whole myriad of often extremely successful, innovative measures they've put in practice. And we really can learn more, I think, internally, as well as from looking at other nations.
Great. I'm going to turn to some questions from Slido, if I may. Just a reminder to people in the room and also to people who are joining us online that please do place questions on Slido. So one of the most common issues, and this has come up in a variety of different forms, relates to your potential position should Labour win the next election as a dedicated Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. And a question that's come up is, clearly these issues of inequalities are cross-cutting. So how would you make sure that the whole of government is on board with making equality work, both economically and socially? Is a kind of dedicated Secretary of State enough? Are there other mechanisms that you might look to use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I don't feel we are responding to it with a blank sheet of paper, however. First of all, because I believe in, obviously, particularly with Harriet Harman, we did achieve there, through having a dedicated, at that point, Minister for Women and Equalities, cross-cutting change, which was joined up. If you look at an area like action against domestic abuse, for example, very clearly that is a criminal justice issue in many ways, policing also, so it cuts across, obviously, Home Office and Justice, then also has implications in a variety of different areas. And clearly Harriet was very, very adept at working across government, ensuring that change was achieved there, and there were some very significant changes made in that area. We've been trying to model in opposition how we would then seek to operate in government. So I chair Labour's National Policy Forum, which is our body that will pull together the policy programme for the next general election, eventually being turned into our manifesto and then presented to the public. We've ensured that for the beginning, we've been asking about equalities and how we can face up to inequalities from, as I say, the very, very beginning of that process. So it's been wired into what we've been doing. So I think you need to have, obviously, an individual who will push this from the top table. You then need to have a shared understanding and awareness of the importance of combating inequality, and I believe that is what we have at the moment. But I would just say, finally, we also need to make sure that we are assessing what government is doing in this area and doing so effectively. We've not seen kind of equality impact assessment really being done properly by government in many areas, and that has been a frustration and something that obviously we want to make sure that we rectify.
So I'm just sort of returning to this theme of kind of international comparison and working with international partners. And one area that a number of people are interested in is obviously in your speech and in your policy, you focus on how the UK might learn from other partners, but there's a kind of other side to that coin where you're engaging with countries or organisations that perhaps don't share the ambitions around inequalities, or potentially even worse, foster inequalities. How would that fit within your kind of framework that you've outlined?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think we can also, as well as learning positive lessons, we can learn pretty negative ones too about what hasn't worked around this agenda, and that is important. But for other countries, I think it is important that ultimately we have policymakers who are very clear about their principles, and that we don't kind of leave these matters to one side when we're engaged in what appear to be other areas of policy making. If you look at trade, for example, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's our International Trade Secretary, he's been very clear that just as we wouldn't want to leave combating the climate crisis to one side when it comes to trade policy, we also don't want to be leaving human rights, for example, to one side in that area, nor indeed do we want to be forgetting about the implications of trade policy for our own workers and some of the kind of income inequalities that we see already in our own country. So I think it is about having that more integrated approach to policy making from the beginning.
Great. I'm actually going to turn now to some issues around delivery and kind of making change, which I think was one of the themes that you identified. And I was really struck by your emphasis on female participation in the paid labour market, and particularly some of the figures that you shared around female participation, kind of 40s and upwards. And it was quite striking to me that you didn't mention things like care, so childcare costs, social care costs, and also care of other relatives and family members, so, you know, older family care, etc. And I just wondered if, you know, surely that must be quite an important part of delivering on this, ensuring kind of access to these different forms of care that, you know, women and other workers are going to need to be able to access.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fundamental, it's critical, and I would say for a number of reasons, actually, because if you look particularly at the age group between 50 and 64, many of those women, and actually some men as well, they will be part of what's quite often called the sandwich caring group. So they're both looking after potentially still their own children, or at least they're still financially responsible for them in some sense. Peak financial responsibility for women is about age 45, as I understand it. But they may also be looking after, of course, grandkids potentially, and after their own parents. And then as they get a little bit older, potentially after their own partner as well. So they are really squeezed in that sense. And I think, you know, obviously there's a huge amount that does need to change there. You know, Labour set out, again, very practical plans on this. Bridget Phillipson, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Education and for Children, she set out plans for free breakfast clubs for every child in primary school in the UK. She set that out because we know how exactly we can pay for that policy and deliver it. I think one of the big issues with the government's approach around childcare, as indeed around some of their measures on social care, is they've not been clear about how they will achieve change and then how they will sustain it. And I think that's pretty problematic. If you look at the childcare commitment in the last budget, for example, actually there's very little indication of how they'll prevent that having a knock-on impact on, you know, some of the funding models of existing providers of childcare. It could actually reduce some of the provision of childcare. So we do want to have that evidence-based approach. You know, it's something that we are working on collectively. We need to ensure, however, that we can deliver that change sustainably and not be making rhetorical announcements and then not seeing the delivery. You know, I really think people have had enough of that.
And then another issue on delivery. So you spoke quite a lot around transparency and the need for businesses to declare different types of pay gaps. And you mentioned evidence that kind of pay gaps delivered change, also reporting on pay gaps. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. The cynic in me kind of thinks, do organisations publish them and then just sort of brush them under the carpet? So I was interested in that.
Yeah, I feel quite differently about this now compared with, say, 10 years ago. As you would expect, I speak with quite a lot of different business audiences, you know, whether small businesses or bigger ones in different parts of the country. And I increasingly find businesses are saying to Labour, well, look, we actually want you to be talking more about these issues because, you know, for example, when it comes to, you know, there's women 50 plus in the workforce, they see themselves that many of those women are leaving the workforce. They want something to be done about it. They're concerned about it. I think particularly in a context where we have seen actually employment levels in many communities falling when we've got those labour market shortages, I think there is quite a determination from many businesses to say, well, you know, what can we do collectively around this that is driven by the evidence? So those pushes for transparency often have come from within companies. You know, I find it quite interesting actually speaking with some of those within SSE, obviously a really big company, and when they started their discussions around gender pay, very much came from within the organisation. It was women in the company actually saying, look, we want to do this. We want to understand what's going on in our company so we can identify any issues and you know, get a grip on them and deal with them. And they have been doing that. So I think, of course, cynicism may be understandable, but I would say that actually when we look at the practical reality of how things are changing in many businesses, I really do see that very strong progress, and it's a shared agenda. You know, I view it as a partnership that Labour wants to have with business, hopefully in government and also with, of course, trade unions and others as well.
Great. So we are at a UK and a Changing Europe event, so I am going to ask a more Brexit-y related question, if I may. So one of the questions that's quite popular is around the kind of access of equality for settled migrants, and that particularly around things like citizenship and secure voting rights. So a kind of set of questions around, you know, how would Labour think about delivering different forms of political equality for groups, of which that might be one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an interesting question. I mean, of course, you know, we were very keen to try and make sure that the EU settlement scheme in particular, that would operate effectively, that people would be treated properly within that. You know, some of the issues around processing individual cases, for example, you know, I've seen them myself as a constituency MP, you know, when there have been many challenges there. And I do think it's important that we get all of these things right, certainly. I would say also, and you know, this is something that Yvette Cooper has talked quite a lot about as our Shadow Home Secretary, more broadly, we need to be making sure that we have an approach to skills development within our own country, which means that we're actually upskilling the domestic population, you know, whether they're EU settled citizens in our country, you know, and others, that we develop those skills domestically so that ultimately we have less of a focus on what's been, you know, occupying a lot of the media attention recently, which has been the huge increase that we've seen in work visas, which, you know, really, if we'd had more domestic training and upskilling, you know, we would not have seen that increase. There's clearly something going quite wrong there with the government's approach they do need to be facing up to.
Yeah, and maybe following on, if I can pick up one of the issues you raised, and I think they were really striking figures actually in the speech, was around health outcomes. So access to health, but also health outcomes, particularly for Asian, Black and minority ethnic communities. Clearly that's going to be very closely wrapped up with the challenges that the NHS faces, which are not entirely separate from questions of equality, given that we know that, you know, in health and care in particular, women often dominate. So I was just wondering how that very tight circle can be squared, where you're seeing kind of unequal outcomes in terms of health geographically, but also in terms of different types of groups of people, with a kind of commitment to kind of fostering greater equality in terms of labour market participation within the NHS, given where we are on that.
I don't feel there's any opposition, actually, because I feel when we remove those barriers to opportunity, that's something that ultimately will benefit everyone. I feel that a zero-sum approach to these issues doesn't really understand the nature of the context that we're in. I mean, if you consider, for example, some of those shortages that we have at the moment in the UK in the healthcare workforce, and obviously Wes Streeting has been focused on this as our Shadow Health Secretary. Actually, we've not seen the amount of particularly progression across the board that we need to see. We've not seen the recruitment that we need to see. You know, I remember the days, and you know, I'm sure there's some people in this room who will have had similar experiences probably. When I was at school, I mean, I didn't end up doing anything like this, obviously, as you all know, because I'm a politician now. But I remember speaking with the then careers teacher, and at that point, way back then, I said, oh, you know, I'm quite interested maybe in being a doctor. And he said, well, that's very good. Have you thought about being a nurse, though? And I think nurses are amazing. I think they're brilliant. We need to have far more people going into nursing from all backgrounds. But, you know, we still see some of those kinds of categorizations of people too often, actually, even in terms of NHS careers, when, you know, in many ways the NHS has been a success story, actually, in terms of increased inclusion and certainly some of the disciplines within it, but we do need to go further. And I think unless we do, we're not going to have that kind of workforce, not the volume nor the quality that we need in order to face up to some of those big, big issues for the NHS, you know, particularly enormous waiting lists.
And I guess that makes me think as well of the ways in which inequalities might be inculcated from quite early ages through things like our education system, for example. So there's really interesting research on, you know, the ways in which play spaces are set up in primary schools that kind of direct individuals to particular kind of gendered stereotyped roles. You know, there's clearly the impact of the pandemic on education as well as kind of funding issues. So I was just wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about the role of education and by extension possibly skills in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount here that needs to be done to ensure that every child really is able to seize the opportunities that should be open to them. And I think if you look at particularly STEM careers, we've seen so much discussion of this over so many years, and yet we still see very, very small numbers of women ending up in leadership positions in technology, for example, or in science careers. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Sion Wura, who's our Shadow Science and Technology Minister, she's written a lot about this, around what needs to be done, really starting very, very early to persuade young children and girls and those from backgrounds that tend not to go into some of those subjects that they are for them, actually. And I think it can take quite a big mindset change, some of this. My children, they sometimes watch German TV, and there's a program on there called Descending mit der Maus, which is the program with the mouse. And on this program, kids get to see how a factory works. They get to see how you make ball bearings, or you get to see how you make a bike, or whatever it is, Is there any equivalent such focus always in our country that really indicates to children and young people these are careers for everyone, something to be interested in, that you can do, that you can focus on? I don't think there is, actually. And so we really do need to be making sure that we're breaking down the psychological barriers as well as some of the harder ones, perhaps.
Yeah, I just want to return, if I may, to the issues around minority ethnic households and black households. So you, again, posed some really striking figures in the speech about, what could happen if employment opportunities increase for those groups. On the other side of the coin, we've got quite interesting figures for those households about their spending capacities and the ways in which the cost of living crisis is disproportionately affecting those groups. So I think Labour's own analysis suggests that black households are 4 times more likely to be behind in rent and mortgage payments. We know that black children, the rate of increase in poverty amongst that group is growing rapidly. So you've said quite a lot about the sort of employment side of the picture. I was just wondering, on the kind of other side of the coin, around the kind of cost of living and household consumption and spending, how that might figure in these kinds of debates.
Yes, I mean, I do think that employment, however, is very important, because if you compare the debate at the moment around the cost of living crisis in Britain, I think it's quite different to that in many other countries. Because in our nation, it takes place after 13 years where we've seen, for a really long time, stagnant living standards, actually. Very, very little increase. There was then just a little bit of an increase, and then we had the pandemic. So we've had that squeeze on living standards that many other countries haven't had, actually, to the same extent. Why do I think that's relevant? I think it's important because it means that now we've got a cost of living crisis when so many families don't have any ballast. They haven't got any, anything there to squeeze. They don't have savings. They don't have money put away. They can't scale back their costs for reasons that I'll come on to. And so I think very often they're in a particularly difficult position compared to those in other countries, if you look at kind of relative socioeconomic status. So I do think income's important for that reason. But secondly, I think if you look at areas of cost that have increased as well, really frustratingly, some of this has been made worse by political decision. You've seen many families, the cost of their mortgage has gone up, in some cases by about £500 a month because of all the turbulence that we saw at the end of last year, then feeding in to this year as well. Again, decisions taken around planning, adding about 200 quid onto many people's rent because it's leading to that squeeze on the availability of housing. On food, higher food inflation in Britain than in many other countries. Why? Well, we've got all the issues at our ports, etc., and failure to deal with supply chain issues where we've said, for example, you need to have a veterinary agreement with the EU. Lots of other countries have them. Australia has one. We're right next to the EU, and yet we still don't have one. So you have those extra costs there that are unnecessary, actually, that are there because of a lack of political action. So both dealing with the income of those families, I think, and employment, but then also bearing down on the costs that they're subject to, I think, is going to be very important. And then finally, as I mentioned before, actually plugging the holes in that windfall tax so that we can make sure that we're bearing down on the cost of living more.
So as a bit of a Brexit geek, I could really delve into the agreements with the EU, but I think approaching 5:30, I maybe will save people. I just wanted to kind of close really reflecting on how you started your speech. So you talked about your kind of career in politics. And one of the questions that's come through in various ways are questions about, how can we make our elected politics? The question actually talks about the Westminster system. Being a non-Londoner, I would talk about regional as well and the devolves. But how can you encourage kind of further progress towards kind of equal and diverse representation in those spaces, which surely must be part of the picture?
Definitely. I feel that, yes, you need to have encouragement and training, and you need to have attempts to ensure people are well networked and that they have those resources available. But I think Labour's story shows very clearly you've got to have hard rules as well. That you can have a lot of training, but ultimately, sometimes you just end up training people who are already very highly qualified, but who are just not able to break through the glass ceiling. So, obviously Labour's experience with things like all women shortlists has been one that, once you put those measures into place, you can get really quite rapid progress. And now Labour's the only major party that does have parity with the population when it comes to representation of women. Also in terms of Black, Asian, minority ethnic representation, we've worked very hard to try and encourage people to get involved. Still more work to do, certainly, no question about that. But I do think, we've got to be quite honest with ourselves sometimes about, again, what works and what just isn't going to go far enough a lot of the time. We're currently in a situation where the Equality Act is based around reaching parity in the population. So Labour isn't able to use all women shortlist for the next election. So we're really trying to use other mechanisms to ensure that women are still applying, that they're still making that progress within the system. But I think, just saying, oh, well, any such measures, or they just lead to tokenism or whatever, we hear those arguments sometimes from those on the political right. I'm afraid the evidence is that to get that change, you need to have a combination of measures. You can offer all the encouragement you want in the world, but if there's no hard measures anywhere, you're just not going to get that progress.
Great, thank you very much. It's almost bang on 5:30, so I'd like to thank you for an absolutely fascinating speech. There's so many questions, so many ideas that it's provoked for me and clearly for the audience. Thank you very much for giving the time to speak to us, and I'd like to thank Anneliese in the usual way. Thank you very much.